Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, had this one recommended to me by several people in the last few days, and it's a video along a similar theme to some videos we've done in the past, and that has to do with top mistakes in history that have changed history. And I'll put some links down in the description to other such videos that we've reviewed in the past, and we're going to take a look at this one. This is from a channel I've never reviewed before. It's called List25, so I don't know what their stuff's like, but they've got 2.6 million subscribers, so obviously a lot of people watch them. I'll put the link down in the description so you can check that out and all their other content without my commentary. We'll let each one of these play as they go, and I'll offer my feedback, how viable I think that is, and how it compares to other moments in history. Let's dive into this one.
History is filled with pivotal moments, grand battles, inspiring triumphs, and incredibly costly mistakes. Despite our best intentions, humanity seems prone to rid the earth of ourselves. So if you walk away with anything from this list today, it'll be that human error can ruin even the most well-laid plans. I'm Mike with List25, and from typos with explosive consequences to misplaced decimals that created a spinach myth, here are 25 mistakes that changed the course of history forever.
So I'll just say up front, I don't know what he's going to cover in this. But we love to make moments matter more than they really do sometimes. We love for things to have black and white, this bad thing happened, therefore this consequence. And as we repeatedly say, one of the great themes of this channel is that history is nuanced. It's gray. It's not black and white. It's never simple, and it's all connected. So, so for example, we love to talk about turning points where this one pivotal moment changed everything forever. And that's true of all moments, right? Any decision that gets made, any turning right instead of turning left affects everything that comes after it.
25. The Adulterer's Bible. In 1631, printers Robert Barker and Martin Lucas made a typographical error for the ages. Instead of the clear commandment, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," their version of the Holy Scripture declared, "Thou shalt commit adultery." We might smile about the typo today, but at the time it caused a public uproar since it was a time of deep religious devotion. The printers faced heavy fines and lost their royal license, while the Adulterer's Bible became a haunted relic and a highly sought-after collector's item.
Wow. So here's the thing about this. Remember, this is a time in history when you're just getting into the time when the masses are getting the Bible in their own language. For most of history, it's been in things like Latin, like the Latin Vulgate Bible. Very few people were educated enough to read the Bible, and it was intentional that way. It was, in some places, not long before this, a capital offense to translate the Bible into the vulgar language or the language of the people. And so this is probably a bigger deal than it would be today if this same kind of thing happened. That said, even without misprints, there are sometimes people who misconstrue certain things or misinterpret or misquote. For example, one of my favorites that people love to say is that the Bible says in the Ten Commandments, "Thou shalt not kill." But most translations correctly put it as "thou shalt not murder," which is very, very different if you think about it.
24. The Chilean Mint. In 2010, Gregorio Anías, the Chilean mint director, accidentally found his way to infamy. While minting a batch of 1.5 million 50 peso coins, a typo somehow made it through quality control checks. And instead of reading Chile, the coins read Chile. Trust me,
awesome.
You do not want to be in that.
That said, I wish they'd change the title of this. These are really interesting facts. These are really fascinating. And I love that they're including these because they're lesser known. But are they really things that changed history forever in some significant way? That I don't think.
That kind of a hot seat ever. The typo turned out to be more expensive than you can imagine.
That's awesome.
The minting of the faulty coins cost Chile about $30,000. The incident wasn't only embarrassing, it also became a cautionary tale for other mints worldwide.
In the grand scheme of government spending, is $30,000 really that big a deal?
23. The NASA hyphen mishap. In 1962, a programmer's error ended a multi-million-dollar mission to Venus before it even left Earth's atmosphere. As a result of a missing hyphen in Mariner 1's guidance code, it veered off course shortly after launch. Faced with the potential for a catastrophic failure, NASA decided to destroy the spacecraft. Today, there are several systems in place to prevent errors like the one that's now known as the most expensive hyphen in history.
That's interesting.
It includes multiple code reviews, built-in redundancies and fail-safes, independent verification and validation, and thorough analysis to identify areas for improvement. 22. The D-Day birthday. The success of the D-Day invasion hinged on a stroke of unexpected luck, courtesy of a birthday party. General Erwin Rommel, a formidable field marshal of the German forces in Normandy, was absent from his post on this crucial day of June 6, 1944. The reason? Well, his wife's birthday bash. His absence created chaos and delays in the German command structure, which proved a critical advantage for the Allied forces. With less resistance on the beaches, the Allies secured a foothold in Normandy, ultimately shifting the tide of World War II.
So I'll say this about this one, and I think this is one a lot of people are familiar with. Did it change the outcome? No. Could it have made it slightly more complicated for the Allies? Sure. But remember, the Allies, the breakout from Normandy took weeks and weeks and weeks before they really made any significant progress. So the idea that Rommel being there and acting more quickly would have somehow significantly slowed down the Allies more, I don't know. There was this ongoing debate with the German high command about is our strategy going to be to try and stop the Allies at the beach, because once they get inland we're screwed and there's nothing we can do, or do we let them get inland a little ways, then counterattack and crush them further in? And so that's kind of going back and forth. And remember, too, Rommel is not the guy in charge of the Western Front. He's not even the guy that's in command of all of the forces in the Normandy area. So it's not like other generals weren't there and able to do things. So I think that one maybe gets overblown a little bit.
21. Excite and Google. In the realm of technology, underestimating the potential of a startup can have the type of consequences that turn you into an example of what not to do for the rest of your life. For example, in 1999, the then dominant web portal Excite had the opportunity to buy Google for a measly $750,000. Excite passed on the deal. Yeah, I know. What must that kind of regret feel like? You know, I don't really want to know. Today, the market capitalization of Google is over $1.76 trillion US dollars, making it one of the most valuable companies in the world. Excite, on the other hand, was acquired by another company in 2004 and eventually shut down its search engine operations.
So here's my only question about this, and I'm not debating this one. That is a really interesting fact and pretty fascinating to think about. The question, of course, becomes, if Excite buys Google, does Google become Google? Or does it just become one more failed project like Excite? I don't know. I guess it depends on where in that process it was and how that would have impacted Google's trajectory. I don't know the answer to that.
20. The French military's blunders in Vietnam. After the end of World War II, France found itself smack bang in the middle of a Vietnamese population longing for independence from colonial rule. The Viet Minh, a communist movement determined to remove French rule, was born, and France's efforts to maintain control backfired spectacularly. Their reliance on static fortifications like Dien Bien Phu was completely useless against the Viet Minh's guerrilla tactics and artillery barrages. And since their colonial policies failed to win over the Vietnamese people, France ultimately had to withdraw from the country in 1954. The resultant power vacuum in Southeast Asia, fueled by Cold War anxieties, would soon draw another world power, the United States, into the mix, and the rest is history.
So I don't know, there's not really a specific decision that we're talking about with that one, but this is a larger, broader issue of how that was handled. But I don't know that France or the United States or Japan before that, anybody was going to fare well. And we've seen throughout history what happens when a foreign colonial power tries to hang on to something halfway around the world and faces those kinds of guerrilla tactics and the popular uprising and insurgency like that. If a superpower like the United States couldn't handle that, I don't know that France was ever going to fare any better.
19. The fall of the Berlin Wall. The fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9th, 1989 was probably one of the most climactic moments in the world's history. But there's a great backstory behind the circumstances that actually triggered the event. During a press conference about new travel regulations, Günter Schabowski, a spokesperson for the East German government, fumbled with his notes, in the process unintentionally giving the impression that the border restrictions were lifted with immediate effect. The miscommunication ignited a wave of ecstatic Berliners who surged toward the wall that same night. They overwhelmed the unprepared border guards, and the once powerful symbol of oppression was brought down.
Makes you wonder if they'd done that sooner, what would have happened. Because obviously people had tried to get around it, under it, over it, things like that. Sometimes people had paid for that with their lives, but anytime you have a mass number of people that all go at it at that point, what are they going to do? But more than that, it was a culmination of things that had already been working toward that. And if you're not part of the generations who remember these events, the whole thing goes back to, as we say, everything's connected. East Germany, what became the nation of East Germany, because East and West Germany were separate countries when I was a kid growing up. I was only a teenager when they reunited. And it was the Soviet occupation zone that became East Germany after World War II. And the three zones that were occupied by the British, the French, and the Americans became West Germany. West Germany had its capital in Bonn, but then part of Berlin, West Berlin, was also controlled by West Germany, but, isolated. It's an island. It's like the Vatican. It's in the middle of East Germany. And so there was that wall down the middle that separated the two.
18. The Treaty of Waitangi. The Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840, is often seen as the cornerstone of modern New Zealand. However, it sparked a great deal of debate. What's at the crux of the matter? 2 languages and 2 different interpretations. The English version of the treaty communicated the power transfer to the British Crown, but in the Te Reo Maori version, the Maori would keep control of their lands and their way of life. I don't know, that's kind of the most important part of the agreement. How could they get it wrong? What do you think? Was it a simple misunderstanding or a deliberate act on the part of the English?
I mean, you could just always do what the U.S. government did in our treaties with the Native Americans and give them whatever words they want and then just go back on it a few years later.
One thing is certain, however. It sparked a legacy of mistrust and resentment that continues to haunt Maori Crown relations to this day. 17. Hitler's wonder weapons. During World War II, Hitler made several mistakes, but one of the biggest that we rarely discuss was probably his decision to put his resources into a variety of experimental weapon projects. While some, like the V-2 rocket, were technically impressive, they came too late and weren't produced in large enough numbers to change the war's outcome.
They were good weapons, though, and like the Me-262, the jet fighter, he didn't know they were too late when they were designing those things, right? I mean, you have to pour resources into technology, especially when you know you can't outproduce your opponent. You have to try and find a game changer. And it seems to me that if you're Germany and you're overwhelmed by the power and resources of your opponents, you need a game changer to stay in the game at all. And so I feel like they had to do that.
Hitler's decision came at a cost. Germany's more traditional weaponry, like tanks and planes, suffered as resources were diverted, and the gamble on wonder weapons backfired.
I don't think it would have mattered. I don't think Germany was ever going to produce enough.
16. The misplaced decimal point that made spinach a superfood.
I'd like to take issue with whoever made spinach a superfood.
The iconic image of Popeye downing a can of spinach and changing into a superhuman is part and parcel of our pop culture. However, the scientific basis for spinach's supposed strength-enhancing properties comes from a fascinating but comical historical error. In the 1870s, a German scientist published research on the iron content of foods. Unfortunately, he misplaced a decimal point and inflated spinaches by a factor of 10. His error stayed undetected for decades and gave parents everywhere the misconception that spinach was a superfood capable of granting immense strength. Today, we know that spinach is a valuable source of vitamins and minerals, but that its true iron content is much, much lower than we originally believed.
So again, maybe I'm hanging on to this too much, but I feel like this is just a badly named video, and maybe that's just for clicks. I don't know. But these are really fascinating, and I actually find it a really interesting video with some pretty cool topics that we don't normally discuss when we're talking about mistakes in history. But changed history forever?
15. The windows on passenger airplanes. Those small airplane windows may be a bit inconvenient when we're flying over something beautiful, but trust me when I tell you that there's actually a lot of scientific thought behind their design. You see, unlike square windows with stress concentrating corners, round windows distribute pressure more uniformly. And we learned that the hard way. The de Havilland Comet, introduced in 1952, included square windows as part of its sleek design. Unfortunately, several de Havilland Comets crashed in the early 1950s due to square window failures. Yeah. So while larger square windows might seem like a natural progression as we go forward, it might be better to stick to the little round designs for safety's sake.
And I don't know if you've seen these, if you've been on any of these planes yet, but I love the new design, the ones that don't have the shades that come down, that are controlled by a button, and you can actually dim them. So you can still see out the window, but it doesn't let light in, and it doesn't like bother you. And then it can be controlled by the cabin crew. They can darken all the windows automatically without having to tell people to put their window shades up or down. Really fascinating technology.
14. The missed switch. Have you ever heard of the New York City blackout of 1977? If you're not American, this might be the first time. A lightning strike crippled the Con Edison power grid and plunged the city.
Listen, the summer of 77 was a crazy year, okay? You have this blackout. You have the Son of Sam killings happening in New York. Elvis died. I was born. Tom Brady was born. Jonathan Rhys Meyers was born. Rebecca St. James was born. I think we were all born within a week of each other, the four of us. Anyway.
Into darkness. To get the power back on, several switches had to be flipped in an exact sequence. And unfortunately, for one very unlucky operator, one of them was missed.
Dude.
The city ended up with a 25-hour blackout with devastating consequences. The stifling summer heat and lack of electricity ignited a wave of looting, arson, and destruction across the city. The total damages ended up being around $300 million for a single missed switch.
Could you even imagine being the person who did that? Simple mistake. On any other job, hitting the wrong switch might not be a big deal. Sometimes it is.
13. The costly game. Before I continue, let me ask you something. How passionate are you about a game of poker? In 1776, General George Washington's troops launched a daring Christmas night raid on Trenton, New Jersey that changed the course of the American Revolution.
It did.
However, fate nearly handed victory to the Hessians occupying the town. A loyalist farmer learned of Washington's plans and sent a warning note to Hessian commander Colonel Johann Rall. Unfortunately for the Hessians, Rall was playing a game, some say chess and others say poker, and either didn't care or completely ignored the note. His oversight led to the Hessian defeat and became a turning point in that war.
So there's debate about that, but one thing we absolutely can say is that they weren't all hung over from a long night of drinking the night before. And honestly, they managed to organize a fairly decent defense. And surprisingly, the Americans didn't suffer a single combat death. The closest they came was a young officer named James Monroe, who very nearly died of a wound. And his life was saved by one of the doctors. I think there were a couple of deaths from exposure from the weather, but no combat deaths for the Americans. So it was an overwhelming success. It absolutely... A factor of that was Johann Rall not having his men properly prepared and properly on guard. And he had complained about that, about their isolation at that outpost. And the British and the Hessians had men kind of spread out all over New Jersey in these little 1,000-man outposts, which made them susceptible to something like what Washington did. And while I've been very critical of Washington as a battlefield commander, Trenton... and the campaign that followed with Princeton and Assunpink Creek is brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant and probably did save the war for the Americans.
12. Civil War rifles. If you want to hear about an unfair fight, imagine charging into battle with a clunky single-shot musket while the other side fires a barrage of bullets at you from their modern breech-loading rifles. This was the reality for the Union Army during the early years of the American Civil War, thanks to James Ripley, the Chief of Ordnance. Ripley, obsessed with saving money, clung to the outdated muskets, dismissing the obvious superiority of breech loaders. Fortunately,
it wasn't the reality of the Union, though, because it's not like the Union was using muzzle loaders and the Confederacy was facing them with breech-loading rifles. They weren't. The Union had better weapons than the Confederacy did. Whatever the Union was struggling with, the Confederacy had it worse.
With Ripley's removal in 1863, common sense prevailed, perhaps aided by mounting losses. The Union finally adopted the modern rifle, giving its soldiers a fighting chance and eventually securing victory.
Rifles are not the same thing as breech-loading rifles. Rifles just refers to the grooves on the inside of the weapon, which make it more accurate at longer distance, especially with mini balls. The Union absolutely had more rifles than the Confederacy did, but both sides had them. Breech-loading is all about loading it from the rear, rather than having to put your musket down, load it from the muzzle, tamp it down in there, and go through that whole process and get off 2 or 3 shots a minute. So breech loading meant you could load faster and be more efficient on the battlefield. Not sure who wrote that one.
11. The Spy Who Slept and Lost His Papers. In July 1915, the course of World War I took an unexpected turn thanks to a sleepy German spy and a sharp Secret Service agent. Heinrich Albert, the paymaster of a German spy ring in the US, dozed off on a train and, after waking up, accidentally left his briefcase full of sensitive documents behind. His mistake proved disastrous for the Germans. A vigilant Secret Service agent recovered the briefcase and the network was revealed. However, instead of a direct confrontation, the US government leaked the information to the press, and the resulting public outrage eventually led to the US's entry into the war.
The resulting public outrage from a spy network? No, it was multiple factors. This is 1915. This is still a good slightly less than 2 years before the U.S. enters the war. In 1916, a year after these events, Woodrow Wilson's still running on a platform of "he kept us out of war." So I don't see the direct correlation between this. It's much more about, you've got things like the Zimmerman telegram, you've got unrestricted submarine warfare that's sinking passenger ships that are sometimes carrying munitions, but also carrying Americans, ones like the Lusitania and the Housatonic. You have those kinds of factors playing much more of a role than a spy ring.
10. A faulty repair on a Boeing 747. The aviation industry takes safety extremely seriously, and for good reason.
That was an Airbus 321. Those are nice planes. I like them a lot.
As we've come to learn, a single mistake can have devastating consequences.
Which is kind of interesting when we're talking about Boeing that they show an Airbus. But
case in point, the crash of JAL Flight 123 in 1985.
Yeah.
A previous defective repair to the plane's tail section proved disastrous. The compromised tail section failed mid-flight, and the aircraft was obliterated. All 520 people on board died, making it the deadliest single aircraft accident in history. And while it's not a pleasant lesson by any means, the JAL 123 crash revealed the high cost of cutting corners in aviation, and meticulous maintenance and stringent oversight in the industry became the norm. Looking at you, Boeing. If anyone knows the CEO of Boeing, share this list with them.
So the deadliest crash in history of airliners is 2 planes. It was at Tenerife. It was the Tenerife disaster. It's a nightmare scenario. You had 2 massive planes with hundreds of passengers colliding on the runway. You should definitely check that one out sometime.
9. Henry Tandy's decision.
If this really happened, probably did.
History is full of what-ifs, and one such scenario revolves around a British soldier by the name of Henry Tandy. In the middle of World War I, Tandy came across a wounded German soldier near Mâcon, France. According to some accounts, that young soldier was none other than Adolf Hitler. Tandy, defying the brutality of war, chose to spare the soldier's life. I think we can all agree that his act of compassion probably led to one of the most thought-provoking what-ifs in history.
So he didn't just come across him, he spotted him with his gun, and Hitler had been, for a good bit of the war, was a messenger. He ran messages back and forth between the front lines and headquarters, things like that. And he spots him, and he has a chance to kill him. And this would have happened tens of thousands of times on battlefields, where a soldier had an enemy soldier in his sights who posed no threat to him and chose not to fire. What happened in this case is that years later, after Hitler comes to power, this story gets run, and Henry Tandy says, "Oh, I was that guy." And it leads to this fascinating what-if scenario.
8. George Washington's French blunder. Well, if today's list has taught us anything, it's that spelling matters. But we should probably add correct translation to our lessons learned. In 1754, a skirmish between George Washington,
When Washington started the French and Indian, therefore the 7 Years' War.
His troops and a French patrol spiraled into a full-blown war, largely due to a mistranslated document. Washington signed the agreement, unaware that it portrayed the encounter as an assassination by his men, rather than the skirmish it was. This misunderstanding, layered on existing tensions between Britain and France, was the spark that ignited the French and Indian War, a bloody conflict that reshaped North America.
And was a part of the larger 7 Years' War. Some people call that World War Zero. Reshaped Europe as well. And again, is one of those things in a long line of connected issues that will lead to the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, the Franco-Prussian War, the First and Second World Wars. Does any of it happen if George Washington doesn't make this mistake? That one definitely belongs in this list, I think.
7. The 2017 British Airways delays. I love traveling, but I hate waiting at airports. How about you? In May 2017, travelers around the world faced chaos when a human error knocked out a British Airways data center. This computer outage caused the grounding of hundreds of flights, leaving over 75,000 passengers stranded. The timing was terrible. A busy holiday weekend meant many frustrated travelers were left scrambling to reach their destinations. While some flights were canceled, others faced long delays. Airports became crowded with passengers dealing with cancellations, rebooking flights, and
This has happened a lot, though, hasn't it?
lost luggage. The IT meltdown cost British Airways millions of dollars and exposed a major vulnerability.
We just had this happen with a Microsoft issue like a month or two ago.
Our reliance on technology in today's interconnected world. 6. The missing key.
Titanic.
The unsinkable Titanic met a watery grave in 1912. And according to one theory, we can blame the event on a forgetful officer.
Nope.
David Blair, the former second officer, apparently set sail on a new ship with a very important key still in his pocket. His seemingly minor mishap left the crow's nest locker, containing the most important binoculars on Earth that night, inaccessible to the crew. Would these missing binoculars have changed the disastrous outcome?
No.
We may never know for sure, but it's a frightening reminder of how seemingly minor events can have catastrophic consequences.
We've talked about this one before. I think this one's fairly simple to debunk. Number one, if it was that big a concern, they could have just broken the lock on the case and gotten the things out. But number two, the issue that night was that it was such a calm sea and it was a moonless night that there was no way to see the iceberg until they got close, because you didn't have waves crashing into the base of it, making those white caps, which is what you would see first. And I don't see how having binoculars would have dramatically changed that.
5. The Spice Wars. The real Spice Wars were all about nutmeg, and they were brutal. In the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company, VOC, wanted a monopoly of the valuable ingredient. Nutmeg, found only in Indonesia, commanded a fortune in Europe. The VOC wasn't above strong-arming their way to control. Negotiations with the Bandanese people failed, and the company chose violence.
The company chose violence. So much of history, we talk about lenses through which we see history. Trade is one of the major lenses we have to view the 14, 15, 16, 17, 1800s. So many military and diplomatic events and wars even happened because of trade and access to resources.
In 1621, the brutal military campaign led to the massacre of thousands of Bandanese civilians. The VOC secured their nutmeg monopoly, but at a horrifying cost.
Gotta have that nutmeg.
4. Hannibal's snowdrift. Hannibal Barca, the legendary Carthaginian general, wasn't one to shy away from a fight. During the Second Punic War, he attempted to outsmart the Romans by leading his army across the treacherous Alps in the dead of winter. Can you imagine battling snowdrift with elephants in tow? Yes, they brought elephants. Disaster struck when, according to legend, Hannibal poked a suspicious snowdrift with his cane and triggered a massive avalanche, which buried a significant portion of his army beneath the snow. Weakened and demoralized, Hannibal's forces struggled to continue their campaign and ultimately lost the war.
Yeah, but they didn't lose the war, I don't think, because of that. I mean, there's a lot of other factors. We've talked about this in the Punic Wars videos, but still an interesting thought.
3. The Russian royals and Rasputin. History is full of bad decisions by leaders, and Tsar Nicholas II's trust in Grigory Rasputin is a prime example. This self-proclaimed holy man wormed his way into the Tsar's favor by promising a cure for his son's hemophilia. Desperate, the Tsar and Tsarina embraced Rasputin's influence. His influence grew, and he eventually started advising on political matters. However, Rasputin's reputation was far from holy. Rumors of a lavish and manipulative lifestyle fueled public outrage and chipped away at the public's trust in the monarchy. Seen as a symbol of the Tsar's detachment from the people's struggles, Rasputin's presence became a catalyst for disaster and ultimately contributed to the collapse of the Romanov dynasty.
100% agree with everything he said there. Is it one of the top 25 in history? Maybe, maybe not, but I'm not going to quibble with that. Absolutely, the allowing of Rasputin into their confidences and into their grace and them empowering him significantly contributed to their eventual downfall. It wasn't the only factor, and there were probably more important factors. There were more important factors than that, but it certainly is in that conversation.
2. A study turned Ivy League scandal. Would you pose in the nude if it was required to go to university? Believe it or not, from the 1940s to the 70s, some prestigious universities like Harvard and Yale required their incoming freshmen to take nude posture photos. The program's purpose? To analyze posture and identify skeletal problems. However, the science behind it was shaky at best, and the practice raised serious privacy concerns.
Yeah.
Leaks of photos, including those of well-known figures like George W. Bush, Hillary Clinton, Diane Sawyer, and Meryl Streep, sparked public outrage. The program was eventually condemned,
Never heard of this.
And most of the photos were destroyed. However, some, like those from Yale, were archived and sealed. 1.
I have never heard about that, but that's crazy.
China's warlords. China's mighty Han Dynasty, which ruled for centuries, faced a major crisis in 220 CE. Rebellions threatened to tear the empire apart. In a desperate attempt to regain control, the emperors made a risky decision. They called upon powerful regional leaders to raise private armies and crush the rebellions. Their plan would backfire spectacularly. While the regional leaders were their saviors at first, they soon turned into warlords who only cared about carving out their own territories. The central government, weakened by internal struggles and lacking the military strength to control the warlords, could only watch helplessly as the empire fractured and ultimately collapsed. So,
that's a fascinating thought because we've talked about this, how, sometimes you make a big mistake when you allow someone to figure out how powerful they can be, because then it can turn on you. I think of Edward III, king in England, who makes these royal dukes among his sons, which instead of just empowering his sons, creates a whole new class of powerful landowners who have private armies who then can challenge for the throne, and leads directly to the next 100 years of warfare with the Wars of the Roses and those sorts of things. He didn't really anticipate that part, and the same thing seems to be true with these Chinese warlords as well. So that was fascinating. As I said, maybe I'd dispute the title and the premise of this video, but it was actually a really great list as far as interesting mistakes in history and their consequences. From that standpoint, I thought it was really well done. Is there any other video from that channel that you think I should check out? Let me know in the comment section below, as well as look at some of the other links that I'll put in the description, but also up on the screen for you to check out. Thanks for watching.